Hey everyone, this is a piece by Willy Huhn titled Trotsky's Role in the Russian Revolution, a selection and compilation from historical literature. This is from Trotsky, The Failed Stalin by Willy Huhn. Quote, first section, Trotsky's role in 1905. Quote, in 1905, Leon Trotsky thought more logically and consistently than the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, but the error of Trotsky's conclusions was that Trotsky was, quote, too consistent, end quote. The picture Trotsky drew at that time corresponded exactly to the Bolshevik dictatorship in the first 3 years of the October Revolution, which, as is well known, reached a deadly end by tearing the proletariat away from the peasantry. As a result, the Bolshevik Party was forced to retreat very far, end quote. Martynov, 1923, quoted by Leon Trotsky in the article, Who is Leading the Communist International Today? That appears to be from 1930. Quote, on November 16, 1927, Yofa put a pistol to his temple and shot himself. He left a letter to Trotsky on the table next to him explaining his act. Quote, in this letter from Adolf Yofa to Leon Trotsky, he says, quote, if I were healthy enough, I would also find the strength and energy to fight against the situation that has arisen in the party. But in my present state, I cannot bear the fact that the party should silently tolerate your expulsion from its ranks, although I am firmly convinced that sooner or later a crisis will come which will compel the party to drive away the defilers of the party's honor. In this sense, my death is a protest against those who have brought the party to the point where it can no longer even defend itself against such a disgrace. Dear Leo Davidovich, we have been bound together by 10 years of joint work, and I hope personal friendship, and this gives me the right to tell you at the moment of farewell that what I consider to be your weakness. I have never doubted that the path you have outlined is the right path, and as you know, I have been on your side for more than 20 years, since the beginning of the, quote, eternal revolution, end quote. Parenthesis, permanent revolution, end parenthesis. But I have also always been of the opinion that you lacked one thing, Lenin's inflexibility, Lenin's determination, in case of need, to stick to the work he had begun and not to deviate from the path he had chosen, because Lenin was sure of a future majority, of a future recognition of the correctness of his path. You have always been politically right since 1905, and Lenin too admitted. I have often told you that I heard him say it with my own ears, that in 1905 it was you and not he who was right. In the face of death one does not lie, and I repeat it to you today, end quote. Adolf Yofa. New section. Lenin's position at the outbreak of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Quote, I must emphasize one more fact here, namely that the problem of the socialist revolution immediately confronted the Bolsheviks objectively. Lenin did not bring the socialist revolution with Lenin from abroad in his head. On the contrary, we have a document that shows how Lenin in Switzerland, as long as there was no more precise information about the events in Petersburg and Russia, as long as the lies in the newspaper separated Lenin from these events, did not go any further than the completion of the bourgeois revolution. This document in Lenin's letter to the Swiss workers, which Lenin wrote a few days before leaving Switzerland. There, he says directly that Russia is the most petty bourgeois country in Europe and of course cannot become the immediate scene of the socialist revolution. But Lenin hopes that the democratic revolution in Russia will give an impetus to the socialist revolution in the West. This is the common pattern that can be found from Marx, Engels, and others down to Plekhanov and Rosa Luxemburg. And only in Stockholm, where Lenin saw direct participants in the Russian Revolution and heard what was really going on in Russia, did Lenin outline his famous parenthesis, April Fools and parenthesis, theses, which contained the socialist revolution, end quote. That quote's from M. Pokrovsky, Russian History from the Most Ancient Times to the Year 1917, translated by A. Maslow in 1930. New section. From Lenin's, quote, April Theses in 1917, quote, 2. The peculiarity of the present situation in Russia consists in the transition from the first stage of the revolution, which, as a result of the insufficiently developed class consciousness and inadequate organization of the proletariat, brought the bourgeoisie to power, to the second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poor sections of the peasantry, ... 5. Not a parliamentary republic. A return from the Soviet of Workers' deputies to this would be a step backwards, but a republic of Soviets of workers, agricultural workers, and peasants' deputies throughout the country from bottom to top. 8. Our immediate task is not the, quote, introduction of socialism, but for the time being only the immediate assumption of control of social production and the distribution of products by the Soviet of Workers' deputies, end quote. Lenin. From V.I. Lenin, The Bolsheviks and the Seizure of Power in 1917, Part 1, edited by Alexander Emmel, published in Berlin, 1930, Volume 27 of the Elementary Books of Communism. New section. The position of the old Bolsheviks in spring 1917. Quote, Stalin's policy in Pravda corresponded to the old, outdated principles of Bolshevism, but not to the demands of the moment. Neither Stalin nor Kamenev were inclined or capable of independently changing the party program. The victory of the revolution, the overthrow of the Tsar, confused the minds of the old Bolsheviks. No new, quick-witted slogan was formed, and Stalin's policy ran around between theoretical Bolshevism and practical Menshevism. Without realizing it himself, Stalin fell into the wake of Menshevik phraseology. Stalin's policy became half-hearted, ... Stalin's complete theoretical ineptitude was revealed in these days. Stalin was stunned by the world problems that suddenly opened up before him, ... The Bolshevik Party remained in the background during the first 2 months of the revolution. The Mensheviks also developed a powerful propaganda campaign, which was more skillful and successful than Stalin's pathetic efforts to promote the old program. Despite temporary triumphs, the circulation of Pravda fell, and the soldiers who had just listened enthusiastically to Kamenev were the next moment cheering Kerensky and the Mensheviks with much greater enthusiasm. The further struggle seemed hopeless. Petersburg was neither the Caucasus nor Siberia. The best minds of Russia were here, and the struggle they waged against what they called dull, unspiritual Bolshevism was skillful and tireless. The spirit of the insane, fantastic city of Petersburg began to paralyze Stalin, ... Despair took hold of the Bolshevik leaders. Kerensky's fame rose even higher. Ever higher. Despite the favorable symptoms, the goals of Bolshevism seemed unattainable in the midst of the bourgeois revolution. On a gloomy evening in Petersburg, after fruitless speeches in the Soviet, after an announcement of the catastrophic fall in the circulation of Pravda, a short telegram was sent from the Petersburg office to Lenin in Zurich. Quote, the situation is hopeless, Bolshevism is falling, further work is pointless, end quote. Beneath the telegram were signatures, Stalin, Kamenev. Lenin's reply came on the 16th of April. This reply was the railway carriage that arrived at the Finland station in Petersburg that day and ... brought Vladimir Lenin home from his long exile ... Stalin and Kamenev received the leader, ... Lenin left the station. An armored car was parked in front of the exit, surrounded by a dense crowd. From the roof of the armored car, Lenin shouted the unheard-of words to the crowd. Quote, "Long live the social revolution, all power to the Soviets, steal what has been stolen," end quote. ... With Lenin's arrival, Stalin's brief period of power ended, end quote. That's from Assad Bey, Stalin, a biography, published in 1931. It could actually be Assad by, but I'm not sure. Let's see if there's anything comes up for this character. All right, this seems like this might be a character here. Lev Nussenbaum, who lived from 1905 to 1942, who wrote under the pen names Assad Bai and Kurban Said, was a writer and journalist born in Kiev to a Jewish family. Lev Nussenbaum lived there and in Baku during his childhood before fleeing the Bolsheviks in 1920 at the age of 14. In 1922, while living in Germany, he obtained a certificate claiming that he had converted to Islam in the presence of the Imam of the Turkish embassy in Berlin. He created a niche for himself in the competitive European literary world by writing about topics that Westerners in general knew little about: the Caucasus, the Russian Empire, the Bolshevik Revolution, newly discovered oil, and Islam. Lev Nussenbaum wrote under the name of Assad Bai, or Bey, in German. Historians and literary critics who knew these subjects well discredited Assad Bai as a reliable source. Today, historians disregard books published under his name and rarely quote him, though the topics Assad Bey chose to write about are still critically relevant. The fact that Assad Bey was so prolific calls into question the authorship of these books. Whether Assad Bey was primarily operating as a broker and doctoring manuscripts and marketing them under his pseudonym, which had become famous. In 1934, his agent, Werner Schendel, warned him to slow down and take a year off between books so that he would not appear to be so prolific. That year, no books were published in German, only 2 novellas in Polish. Jesus Christ. Back to the text. Quote, Lenin's speech at the Finland station on the socialist character of the Russian Revolution came as a bombshell to many leading party leaders. The polemic between Lenin and the supporters of the, quote, implementation of the democratic revolution, end quote, began on the same day, end quote. Trotsky, 1917, The Lessons of the Revolution, edited by Paul Levy. I think I have an introduction to that piece by Paul. It's not Levy, it's a Levy. Levy is how you pronounce it on this channel. New section. Statement of the Kamenev-Stalin Group against Lenin in April 1917. Quote, in yesterday's issue of Pravda, Comrade Lenin published his, quote, theses. They represent Comrade Lenin's personal opinion. As for Comrade Lenin's general scheme, we consider it unacceptable insofar as it assumes that the bourgeois democratic revolution has been completed. As for Comrade Lenin's general scheme, we consider it unacceptable insofar as it assumes that the bourgeois democratic revolution has been completed, and insofar as it is calculated to transform this revolution into a socialist revolution immediately. The tactics which follow from such an assessment are quite different from those which the representatives of Pravda defended at the All-Russian Congress, both against the official leaders of the Soviet and against the Mensheviks, He wanted to drag the Soviet to the right. We hope to gain acceptance in the broad discussion of our standpoint as the only possible one for revolutionary social democracy if it wishes to remain the party of the revolutionary proletarian masses, which it must be, and not become a group of communist propagandists, end quote. Published in Pravda, April 21st, 1917, quoted in Alexander Emmel. New section. Trotsky's position in spring of 1917. Quote, the staff of the Russian and Foreign Party press have pointed out 100 times with regard to my book, War and Revolution, that if one looks at my work during the war as a whole, one must recognize that my differences of opinion with Lenin were of a very minor nature, and that, as a determined revolutionary, I developed more and more, not only in words but also in deeds, towards Bolshevism. I developed more and more, not only in words but also in deed, towards Bolshevism, end quote. Trotsky, The Real Situation in Russia. Quote, I came to Petrograd from a Canadian prison in early May 1917, and on the second day after the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries entered the coalition government, end quote. Trotsky, The Real Situation in Russia. Quote, while passing through Finland, I received the first new Russian newspapers with telegrams about the entry of Tseretelli, Skobelev, and other, quote, socialists into the provisional government. The situation was now completely clear. I became familiar with Lenin's April theses on the second or third day after my arrival in Petersburg. That was exactly what the revolution needed, end quote. Trotsky, from On Lenin, Material for a Biography. Published in Berlin in 1924. I don't know when it was originally published. Quote, when I arrived in Petrograd, or rather at the border station, I learned from the comrades who had been sent to meet us that there was an organization of revolutionary internationalists in Petersburg, parenthesis, the so-called Mezryantsy, in parenthesis, who were considering the question of uniting with the Bolsheviks, but who wanted to wait until my arrival to make a decision. The staff of the Mezryantsy organization, which comprised about 3,000 Petrograd workers, included Uritsky, Adolf Yofa, Lunacharsky, Uranev, Karachin, Vladimirov, Manuilsky, Pozern, Litvins, and others, end quote. From Trotsky, The Real Situation in Russia. I don't know who that quote, I guess that quote is from Trotsky, but Trotsky was part of the Mezryantsy, so I'm not really sure. If this is a quote of someone about like Trotsky, or by Trotsky, or a quote from Lenin. I don't know. It doesn't include Trotsky's name in here, so it's probably not. It's probably actually is Trotsky's quote about himself. Anyway, quote, I arranged with Comrade Kamenev to visit the editorial office of Pravda one of the days after my arrival. The first meeting must have taken place on the 5th or 6th of May. I told Lenin that nothing separated me from his April theses and from the whole course that the party had taken after his arrival, and that I was faced with the alternative of either immediately joining the party organization, quote, individually, or trying to bring with me the best part of the, quote, unifiers, the unifiers being the Mezryantsy, whose organization in Petersburg numbered about 3,000 workers, and with whom there were a number of valuable revolutionary forces, Uritsky, Adolf Yofa, Lunacharsky, Uranev, Karachin, Vladimirov, Manuilsky, Pozern, Lithuanians, Antonov Ovchinko, Antonov Ovchinko had already joined the party at that time. I believed Sokolnikov too. Lenin did not categorically support either one or the other, ... As a result of a tacit agreement, I, for my part, did not force the natural development of events. Our political line was the same. End quote. Trotsky on Lenin. New section. The Trotsky-Lenin alliance against the old Bolsheviks. Quote, it was only with difficulty that Lenin forced his program, the April theses, on the party against the resistance of the old Bolsheviks of the Kamenev type. Kamenev was of the opinion that a socialist workers' party, if it seized power without any coalition, in struggle with all other parties and tendencies, could only carry out a socialist revolution. That's weird. In accordance with previous Bolshevik doctrine, Kamenev considered the attempt to immediately head for the socialist revolution in the Russian agrarian country to be adventurous. Lenin categorically denied that he wanted to introduce socialism in Russia. Kamenev countered that the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasants already existed in reality in the Soviets, and not in a veiled future coalition of the so-called democratic parties. Therefore, the true Bolshevik slogan of the day was, all power to the Soviets. Nevertheless, the fears of the old Bolsheviks were not unfounded. And it is significant that Trotsky joined the Bolshevik Party at the time. Trotsky understood the situation in exactly the same way as Kamenev, only he drew the opposite conclusions. If Lenin was so ruthlessly preparing the Second Revolution, in which the Bolsheviks were to take power alone, eliminating all petty bourgeois and peasant democrats, then this was in reality the socialist goal, regardless of what formulations Lenin still used in his theses. Then Lenin agreed with Trotsky, not in words but in substance. Thus Trotsky was able to become a Bolshevik in the summer of 1917. In doing so, Trotsky did not give up any of his fundamental convictions, but rather saw in Lenin's tactics since March 1917 a move closer to the old Trotskyian teachings. Trotsky did not bring a significant number of followers to the Bolsheviks, but Trotsky did bring his own revolutionary personality, which was able to develop so brilliantly in the critical times to come. The more resistance Lenin encountered from the old Bolshevik leaders, such as Kamenev and Zinoviev, the more closely Lenin aligned himself with Trotsky. The more resistance Lenin encountered from the old Bolshevik leaders, such as Kamenev and Zinoviev, the more closely Lenin aligned himself with Trotsky, in whose unshakable energy Lenin saw his best support. Stalin was still a Bolshevik functionary of the second order at the time. The joint revolutionary work of Lenin and Trotsky initially caused the theoretical differences of opinion between Bolshevism and Trotskyism to recede into the background. End quote. From Arthur Rosenberg, History of Bolshevism, published in Berlin, 1932. And who's Arthur Rosenberg again? Arthur Rosenberg lived from 1889 to 1943 and was a German Marxist historian, writer, and politician. Arthur Rosenberg served in the Reichstag from 1924 to 1928. Sorry, yeah, I was saying if there's anything other important. He was part of the factional group that included Werner Scholem, Ivan Katz, and Karl Korsch. Says expulsions of the left wing of the KPD followed in 1927, but Rosenberg was not himself one of those subject to such treatment. Nevertheless, Rosenberg quit the KPD in April 1927, moved from the political realm to the field of scholarship. He taught at the University of Berlin and served as head of an organization called the League of Rights of Man. Anyway, back to the text. New section. The opposition of the old Bolsheviks to the October Revolution of 1917. Quote, on October 16th, a military revolutionary committee was founded as the legal Soviet organ of the uprising. The right wing of the party was striving to stop the course of events. The struggle between the various tendencies within the party and the struggle between the classes entered the decisive phase. The position of the right wing of the party is most fully and most fundamentally illuminated in a letter entitled On the Present Situation, which bears the signatures of Zinoviev and Kamenev. In the letter, which was written on the 11th of October, 2 weeks before the coup, and sent to the most important party organizations, a resolute opposition to the armed uprising is taken. End quote. From Trotsky, 1917. Quote, in the party leadership, the Zinoviev-Kamenev group was against the uprising, as Zinoviev and Kamenev still saw, the result of which would be the isolation of the Bolsheviks and a socialist adventure with a catastrophic outcome. But with the help of Trotsky, Lenin got his way. On October 10th, parenthesis, October 23rd, according to the new calendar, in parenthesis, the decisive secret meeting of the party headquarters took place in Lenin's presence. A resolution was passed with all votes to 2, according to which the only means of saving the revolution in Russia was the uprising, with the aim of handing over all government power into the hands of the Soviets. This was the party's fate, end quote. From Arthur Rosenberg, History of Bolshevism. New section. Preparation of the October coup d'etat, 1917. Quote, Lenin took the view that the seizure of power was necessary in order not to lose control over the elemental forces of the revolution. Which were already striving for their discharge in anarchist forms. Once this had been done, Lenin said, it would be possible to demobilize the old army, to carry out the liquidation of the landed estates, and finally, to begin the socialization of the most important industries, ... Lenin's view prevailed. At a secret meeting of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party in mid-October, it was decided to instruct the Petrograd workers, the city's garrison, and the Kronstadt sailors to arrest Kerensky's government and to declare the upcoming Second Congress of Soviets to be the bearer of supreme power in the Republic. The die was cast, end quote. That's from M. Phillips Price, correspondent of the Manchester Guardian, in a piece titled The Russian Revolution, Memoirs from the Years 1917 to 1919. Quote, the Bolsheviks did not make the Russian Revolution, but Lenin and Trotsky realized that the great anarchic revolt would come at 12 o'clock, so they proclaimed the Bolshevik uprising 5 minutes before 12, thus creating the impression that the tremendous event at 12 o'clock had come about under their orders. In this way, they gained the authority to continue to lead Russia, end quote. Arthur Rosenberg. History of Bolshevism. Quote, among us in the Central Committee and among the leaders of the party, he, parenthesis, Lenin, in parenthesis, wrote on September 29th, parenthesis, old date, in parenthesis, quote, the trend in opinion prevails that it is better to wait for the Soviet Congress than to seize power immediately. This trend and opinion must be fought, end quote. At the beginning of October, parenthesis, old date, in parenthesis, Lenin wrote, quote, hesitation is a crime. Waiting for the Soviet Congress is a childish game of formalism, a betrayal of the revolution, end quote. Lenin. End quote, end quote. From Trotsky, 1917. Quote, on the 3rd, parenthesis, November, more recent date, end parenthesis, also behind closed doors, another historically significant meeting of the Bolshevik leaders took place. Informed by Saukind, I waited in the corridor by the door, and when Volodarsky came, I heard from him what was going on. Lenin said, quote, November 6 is too early. We need an all-Russian base for the uprising. On November 6, not all the delegates in the Congress will have turned up. November 8th, on the other hand, would be too late. By then, the Congress will have been constituted, and it is difficult for a large organized body to act quickly and decisively. We must go into action on the 7th, when the Congress meets, so that we can say to it, quote, here is the power. What do you think of it? End quote. End quote. From John Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World. Quote, under these circumstances, at the end of September or the beginning of October, parenthesis, old date, in parenthesis, the famous night session of the Central Committee took place in the Sukhanov's apartment. Lenin came there, determined to push through a decision this time in which there was no room for doubt, hesitation, delay, passivity, and waiting. However, even before he attacked the opponents of the armed uprising, he began to rail against those who linked the uprising with the Second Congress of Soviets. Someone had reported to Lenin my words, quote, we have already set the uprising for October 25th, end quote. I had actually used this phrase several times against those comrades who were looking for the path of revolution in the parliament and in a, quote, strong, end quote, Bolshevik opposition in the Constituent Assembly. Quote, if the Congress of Soviets, which is in its majority Bolshevik, end quote, I said, quote, does not seize power, then Bolshevism will condemn itself to dissolution. In all probability, the Constituent Assembly will not be convened either. If, after all that has gone before, we convene the Congress of Soviets with a majority secured for us, we will thereby publicly pledge ourselves to seize power no later than the 25th of October. End quote. Vladimir Ilyich was horrified by this date. The question of the Second Congress of Soviets, he said, did not interest him at all. What significance did the Congress have? Would it ever take place? And what could the Congress itself do in that case? Power must be seized, not tied to the Congress of Soviets. Power must be seized, not to the Congress of Soviets. It was ridiculous and silly to announce the day of the uprising to the enemy. At best, October 25th could be a masquerade, but the uprising must be carried out beforehand and independently of the Soviet Congress. But the uprising must be carried out beforehand and independently of the Soviet Congress. The party must seize power by force of arms, and then we will discuss the Soviet Congress. ... Quote, in any case, end quote, Lenin declared emphatically, quote, the seizure of power must precede the Soviet Congress, otherwise you will be dispersed and you will not be able to hold a Soviet Congress at all, end quote. Lenin, end quote. Trotsky, from Trotsky's On Lenin. New section. Trotsky's role in the October coup of 1917. Quote, when the majority of the Petersburg Soviet fell into the hands of the Bolsheviks, Trotsky was elected chairman, and in this position organized and led the uprising of October 25th, end quote. That's from the notes to volume 14 of Lenin's collected works, quoted in Trotsky, The Actual Situation in Russia. Quote, the Petersburg Soviet, which was entirely under Bolshevik influence, parenthesis, through Trotsky's group, in parenthesis, formed a military revolutionary committee, and all the troops in the capital declared that they would only obey this committee and no longer the general staff. The driving force of the military revolutionary committee was Trotsky. With that decision of the Petersburg troops, the revolution in the capital had actually already triumphed. The revolution in the capital had actually already triumphed before a single shot had been fired, end quote. Arthur Rosenberg, History of Bolshevism. Quote, the temporary, provisional, government wanted to get rid of the garrison troops. The soldiers did not want to go to the front. We gave this natural refusal a political expression, a revolutionary aim, a quote, legal cover. In this way, we achieved a rare unity within the garrison and united it with the Petrograd workers, end quote. Trotsky. Quote, the entire work of practical organization of the uprising was carried out under the direct leadership of the chairman of the Petrograd Soviets, Comrade Trotsky. It can be safely stated that the party owes the rapid transition of the garrison to the side of the Soviets and the bold execution of the work of the Revolutionary Soldiers Committee, mainly and above all to Comrade Trotsky, end quote. Stalin, The Role of the Most Outstanding Party Leaders, published in 1918. But in 1925, Stalin wrote in his book, Trotskyism and Leninism, which was directed against Trotsky, quote, I must say that Comrade Trotsky played no special role in the October uprising and could not have played one, since as chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky simply carried out the will of the corresponding party authority, which directed his every move, ... Comrade Trotsky played no special role, either in party life or in the October uprising, and could not have played one, since he was still a relatively new man in the party during the October period, end quote. Stalin. Quote, Comrade Stalin, with the help of Yaroslavsky, is now trying to build a new history of the organization of the October Revolution on the basis of the fact that the party had at that time created an active committee for the systematic execution of the uprising, whose members, it seems, did not include Trotsky. But Lenin was not a member of this committee either, and this alone shows that the committee had only a very secondary organizational significance. It played no independent role at all. The legend of this committee has now been created for the simple reason that Stalin was a member of it, ... But no matter how hard I strained my memory, I could not answer the question of what Stalin's role was in those decisive days. Not once did I turn to him for advice or cooperation, nor did he show the slightest initiative. He never made an independent proposal, end quote. Quote, Stalin and Yaroslavsky tried with great effort to prove that the active committee set up by the party and consisting of comrades Sverdlov, Stalin, Chershinsky, Bubnov, and Uritsky directed, so to speak, the entire course of the uprising. Stalin pointed out in every way he could that Trotsky was not a member of the committee. But unfortunately, ... in Pravda of November 2nd, 1927, there appeared a detailed extract from the report given by the Central Committee on the period from October 16th to the 29th, 1917. Quote, the Central Committee is creating a military revolutionary center with the following members: Sverdlov, Stalin, Bubnov, Uritsky, and Chershinsky. The center is to be an essential part of the Revolutionary Soviet Committee. This center is to be an essential part of the Revolutionary Soviet Committee, end quote. The Revolutionary Soviet Committee is the military revolutionary committee created by the Petrograd Soviet. There was no other body for the leadership of the uprising. The 5 comrades elected by the Central Committee were to join the staff of the same Revolutionary Soldiers Committee, whose chairman was Trotsky. It would have been superfluous to include Trotsky once again in the staff of an organization of which he was already chairman, ! End quote. And that's from Trotsky, The Real Situation in Russia, Part 3, Stalin Falsifies History. Quote, on November 4th, I attended the session of the pre-parliament in the Mariinsky Palace, ... In the corridors, I met a leading member of the Social Revolutionary Party, from whom I learned that, according to their information, the Bolshevik coup was only a matter of days. Bolshevik representatives had already been appointed at the post and telegraph office, while the sentries let anyone who uttered Bolshevik slogans pass, but scowled at the officials of the Kerensky government, end quote. That's from M. Phillips Price, The Russian Revolution. Quote, on October 24th, old date, the Military Revolutionary Committee occupied the Petersburg Telephone Exchange. On the 25th, other public buildings were occupied. On the 25th, the Winter Palace, the seat of government, was taken. The ministers were arrested. Kerensky fled. On the same day, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets met as scheduled. When the capture of the Winter Palace was reported to it, the pro-government minority left the hall. The majority proclaimed the seizure of power by the Soviets in line with the Bolsheviks, end quote. Arthur Rosenberg, History of Bolshevism. New section, How the October Uprising Took Place. Quote, while the whole world expected to see the Bolsheviks suddenly appear on the streets one morning to shoot down anyone wearing a white collar, the uprising in reality took place quite differently, very naturally and in public, end quote. John Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World. Quote, at about 4 o'clock in the morning, on the day of the meeting of the Congress of Soviets, end parenthesis, I met Zorin in the lobby with a rifle. Quote, we are marching, end quote, he said calmly, but evidently satisfied. Quote, we have arrested the Assistant Minister of Justice and the Minister of Culture. They are down in the basement. One regiment has gone to man the telephone exchange, another to the telegraph agency, and a third to the State Bank. The Red Guard is also on the way, end quote. As we stepped out onto the Smolny steps, we saw the Red Guard marching past, young fellows in workmen's clothes, with rifles and fixed bayonets, talking excitedly to one another, end quote. John Reed. Quote, the next time I met Lenin was on October 25th, in Smolny itself. What time? I have no idea. It must have been towards evening, ... I began to tell him that the military operations had already progressed quite far, and that we were now in possession of a whole series of important points in the city. ... He He eagerly threw himself into all these details of the uprising. I remember the powerful impression that the news made on Lenin, that I had sent out a company of the Pavlovsky Regiment by written order to ensure the publication of our party and Soviet newspaper. Quote, and has the company sent out? End quote. Quote, it has sent out. End quote. Quote, and the newspapers are being typed? End quote. Quote, yes. End quote. Lenin was delighted, which was expressed in exclamations, laughter, and rubbing of hands. Then he became silent, thought for a moment, and said, quote, very well, it will do just fine. It is only a question of seizing power. End quote. I understood that at that moment Lenin finally came to terms with our renunciation of seizing power through a conspiratorial conspiracy. I understood that at that moment Lenin had finally come to terms with our renunciation of seizing power through a conspiratorial conspiracy. Until the last hour, Lenin had feared that the enemy would thwart our plans and take us by surprise. End quote. From Trotsky on Lenin. Quote, the next morning I went back to the Smolny Institute, where a session of the Petrograd Soviet was taking place to elect its delegates to the Second Congress of Soviets, which was meeting that afternoon. Someone next to me whispered that news had just come that the Military Revolutionary Committee, with the help of the Red Guards from the factories and part of the garrison, had occupied the Winter Palace and arrested all the ministers except Kerensky, who had escaped in a car, At about 10 o'clock at night, I left the Smolny Institute, I walked along the bank of the Neva, Opposite the Vasily Ostrov lay the cruiser Aurora and the destroyer with machine guns aimed at the Winter Palace. I was near the Winter Palace, which was now the headquarters of the Military Revolutionary Committee, Before I left, I looked at the trace of a cannonball in the walls of the palace, the only shot that the cruiser had fired, as a sign that the Winter Palace must now be vacated to the new rulers. End quote. From M. Phillips Price, The Russian Revolution. Quote, on October 25th, old date, Trotsky, the brilliant and heroic tribune of the uprising, the tireless and ardent preacher of the revolution, reported to those assembled in the Petersburg Council on behalf of the War Revolutionary Committee, amid thunderous applause, that the, quote, provisional government no longer exists, end quote. And as living proof of this fact, Lenin, whom the new revolution had freed from illegality, appeared on the platform, received with thunderous homage, end quote. Nikolai Bukharin, From the Fall of Tsarism to the Fall of the Bourgeoisie, published in Berlin in 1919. Quote, the Bolsheviks have overthrown the provisional government with the greatest of ease, with almost no resistance worth mentioning, and the majority of the garrison remained neutral, i.e. indifferent, Under such circumstances, the October Revolution surprised me. Surprised is quite the right word, because just as in February, I had not been able to see or wanted to see how events unfolded with admirable logic, end quote. René Marchand, correspondent for the, quote, Figaro and Petit Parisien, Why I Joined the Social Revolution, published in 1919. Quote, the people of Petersburg did not notice the October coup at first in the flood of daily shootings, appeals, and rumors. The people of Petersburg did not notice the October coup at first in the flood of daily shootings, appeals, and rumors. One day after the coup, for example, a delegation from the city council came to Trotsky and asked whether it was true that the Bolsheviks were planning mass demonstrations. Even the press, which wrote day in and day out about the impending Bolshevik coup, forgot to acknowledge the coup when it had been carried out. The newspapers of October 25th reported nothing about the coup. The newspapers of October 25th reported nothing about the coup. Quote, the newspapers had shouted so much and so obsessively about the impending uprising of the armed soldiers, about looting, about inevitable streams of blood and coups, that they simply did not notice the uprising when it actually came, end quote. Trotsky later wrote, end quote, from Assad by Stalin, or Assad Bey. We looked him up earlier. At the 14th Congress of the PSU, which took place in Moscow on April 22nd, the report on the Trotsky case was entrusted to Zinoviev. Zinoviev had already stated in an essay, quote, throughout all these years, Comrade Trotsky has been in our party the expression of that which was not Bolshevik in the purest sense of the word. The expression of that which was not Bolshevik in the purest sense of the word. Trotsky, the representative of these non-Bolshevik deviations, was constrained by the framework of the old Leninist tactics, end quote. Zinoviev. And in a speech in Leningrad at the beginning of February 1925, quote, from a non-Bolshevik, Trotsky has become an ordinary anti-Bolshevik. The measures of the Central Committee, parenthesis, removal from office and imposition of a ban on speaking, end parenthesis, contain only the minimum of what had to be done. The party Congress will have to have the last word on this matter. Anyone who wants to pursue communist politics together with Trotsky is deliberately turning against Leninism, end quote. I'm not sure who says this. It might be still from Zinoviev. But it's from a book, I guess, titled The Tragedy of Trotsky, edited by Grigory Dmitriev, published in Berlin in 1925. Quote, in a whole series of attacks, first against, quote, Trotskyism, then against Zinoviev and Kamenev, Stalin always concentrated on one point, against the old revolutionary emigres. Against the old revolutionary emigres. The emigres are not native elements. They only think of the international revolution. But now new leaders are needed who are capable of realizing socialism in one country. The fight against the emigres, as a continuation, so to speak, of Stalin's letter of 1941 against Lenin, is an inseparable part of Stalin's ideology of National Socialism, end quote. Trotsky, who leads the Communist International today? Quote, Stalin's method of struggle forced me to explain to him during a meeting of the Politburo in 1926 that he was more and more a candidate for the office of gravedigger of the party. Wait, did I say who said the last quote? That's from Trotsky, who leads the Communist International today. Quote, Stalin's methods of struggle forced me to explain to Stalin during a meeting of the Politburo in 1926 that he was more and more a candidate for the office of gravedigger of the party and the revolution, end quote. That quote's from Trotsky, My Struggle with Stalin, in Diary, Volume 10, Issue 10, published March 9th, 1929. And that's the end, and there's a little author's note here that I don't know if I read before, but I'm going to read it down. In 1925, the Tiflis, which is Tbilisi in Georgia now. The Tiflis party newspaper, Zarya Vostoka, published a letter from Stalin dated January 24th, 1911, against Lenin. A letter from Stalin dated January 24th, 1911, against Lenin, in which he called Lenin's fight against the liquidators and conciliators, quote, a foreign storm in a teacup, end quote, and then declared, quote, in general, the workers, parenthesis, in Russia, Huhn, in parenthesis, are beginning to look at foreign countries with contempt. Let them climb the walls as much as they like, but we are of the opinion that if the interests of the movement are dear to them, then they should work, and everything else will work itself out. I think that is the best thing, end quote. Stalin. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.